Your strength will only be tested when the world around you begins to fall apart. Your light will only matter when darkness threatens to consume everything you love. In the winter of 1861, as America stood on the edge of ruin, one man, born in a cabin of rough-hewn logs, was asked to hold together a nation built on freedom, even as it tore itself apart. His name was Abraham Lincoln. But before he became the 16th President of the United States, he was a boy who lost his mother, a farmhand who read by candlelight, a lawyer who stood for justice when silence was safer. When the Civil War began on April 12, 1861, millions believed the country was finished. Lincoln refused to believe that. They called him weak. They called him naive. They said no man could unite a house so divided. And yet, he did not fight with rage. He fought with mercy. Tonight we'll travel through the candlelit years of Abraham Lincoln's journey, from the quiet forests of Kentucky, 1809, to the final night at Ford's Theater, 1865, where the cost of freedom demanded his life. Before we begin, a soft reminder. If these stories of courage and loss help you drift deeper into thought, let this channel stay by your side too. Because every time we look back into history, we don't just hear their story, we awaken our own. Now, let us return to the night when a single voice of compassion held together a nation drowning in its own hate. This is the bedtime biography of Abraham Lincoln. Candle Chapter 1. Born beneath the Whispering Woods, 1809 to 1816. On a Sunday morning, February 12, 1809, the air in Hardin County, Kentucky was still and cold. The wind carried the scent of damp earth through the small clearing at Sinking Spring Farm, a rugged patch of land bordered by oak and hickory trees. Inside a one-room log cabin, dimly lit by the glow of a crackling fire, Nancy Hanks Lincoln labored quietly as her husband, Thomas Lincoln, tended to the small flame that flickered in a stone hearth. At that moment, as dawn broke over the frost-covered fields, a cry filled the cabin. A boy had been born, Abraham Lincoln. Outside, the Kentucky hills glowed faintly under the rising sun, as though nature itself had paused to witness the beginning of a life that would one day reshape a nation. Abraham was born into a world of poverty, but also into a land of promise. A young America, barely 33 years old, still defining its identity. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working carpenter and farmer, a man of strength but little education. His mother, Nancy Hanks, was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply spiritual, the quiet center of the Lincoln home. The cabin had no floorboards, only packed earth beneath their feet. The winter wind slipped through the cracks in the wood, and each night, as the family huddled under thin quilts, the fire was their only comfort. Yet from these humble beginnings, the seed of greatness began to grow. When Abraham was just 2 years old in 1811, the Lincolns moved to another small farm on Knob Creek, still in Kentucky. There, the boy's first memories began to take shape. The winding creek, the smell of corn and wildflowers, the gentle hum of insects in the tall grass. Thomas built a sturdier cabin, and Nancy tended to the small garden that fed them through each season. Abraham would later remember that farm as the place where his earliest thoughts began to form, where he first saw the beauty of the land and the harshness of survival. His mother taught him prayers and stories from the Bible, reading softly by the firelight. Although she had little formal schooling, she passed on something far greater: a love for words and a belief in moral goodness. Neighbors in those hills would remember the boy with his sad eyes and thoughtful silence. He listened more than he spoke. He watched everything: the rain sliding down the window, the way his father's hands shaped wood, the way his mother's voice trembled slightly when she spoke of faith and kindness. The frontier was not a gentle place. Wild animals roamed freely and illness was a constant threat. But for young Abraham, the woods were alive with mystery. He would wander beneath the trees, tracing the patterns of the clouds and wondering how far the world stretched beyond those Kentucky hills. In 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, the family's life changed again. It was a cold winter, the kind that stung the skin and cracked the earth. Thomas Lincoln, weary of legal disputes over their Kentucky land, decided to move north across the Ohio River into Indiana Territory. The promise of new land, free from dispute and richer for farming, drew him onward. On a gray morning in December 1816, the Lincolns packed their few belongings onto a small flatboat. Thomas guided it through the icy waters of the Ohio River, while Abraham held tightly to his mother's hand. The river's current was strong, the air sharp. Snow flurried across the water, touching their faces like whispers of fate. They landed near the Little Pigeon Creek, in what would soon become Spencer County, Indiana. There, beneath the towering sycamores, they began again, a new home in the wilderness. The forest was dense and dark, and every log had to be cut by hand. Thomas built a simple half-faced camp, open on one side to the wind, until he could finish a cabin. Abraham helped as best he could, his small hands carrying wood and water. He was quiet but observant, always studying how things worked, how an axe met the grain, how a fire breathed with each gust of air. That winter the snow fell deep and the nights were long. But Abraham loved the sound of wolves howling in the distance, the crackle of fire, and the stories his mother told beneath the stars. The world around him was one of silence and labor, yet it was there that Abraham's imagination began to bloom. He had little chance for formal education, only a few weeks here and there taught by wandering schoolmasters like Zechariah Riney and Caleb Hazel. Yet, every scrap of paper he found became precious. He traced letters in the dust and copied Bible verses onto wooden boards with a piece of charcoal. He was fascinated by language, by how words could shape thought and how thought could shape destiny. His mother would smile softly as she watched him mouthing the words she read aloud. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Those words, simple and eternal, took root deep within him. But behind every bright dawn lies the shadow of loss. In October 1818, when Abraham was 9, tragedy came quietly. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, fell ill with what people then called milk sickness, a deadly disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten the poisonous white snakeroot plant. There were no doctors, no medicine, only the forest and the sound of her breathing growing weaker. On October 5, 1818, beneath the gray Indiana sky, Nancy Hanks Lincoln passed away. She was 34 years old. Thomas built a simple wooden coffin, and together with neighbors, he buried her on a small rise near their cabin. Abraham stood silently beside the grave, tears on his cheeks, his small hand gripping the Bible she had once read to him. Her loss marked him forever. In that quiet forest clearing, something in the boy deepened, a tenderness, a melancholy, a quiet strength. Years later he would say, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." The winters that followed were hard. The cabin grew colder, food scarcer. But Thomas Lincoln, ever resilient, built their home stronger log by log. In December 1819 he married Sarah Bush Johnston, a kind and practical widow from Elizabethtown, Kentucky, who brought warmth and order back into their lives. Abraham loved her deeply, calling her mother for the rest of his life. She brought with her 3 children and, more importantly, books, precious, rare treasures in the wilderness. Abraham devoured them. Aesop's Fables, The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, and the Life of George Washington. He read late into the night by the dim light of the fire, his face glowing in the amber flicker, his eyes filled with curiosity. Through those stories he began to see the world beyond the woods, the struggles of men, the meaning of freedom, the idea that one person could change the course of history. Each word he read became a spark, lighting a quiet fire inside him. By 1820, as he entered his 12th year, the tall, solemn boy from the Indiana woods had already begun to carry the weight of thought far beyond his age. He could swing an axe like a grown man and read better than most adults in the settlement. But above all, he carried a gentleness, a habit of kindness that made him different. When neighbors quarreled, he sought to make peace. When animals were hurt, he nursed them. When others mocked him for reading instead of hunting, he only smiled. Something in him already knew that strength was not found in the arm, but in the heart. And so, beneath the whispering woods of Indiana, a boy shaped by hardship, silence, and the love of 2 mothers, one lost, one found, began his journey toward immortality. The cabin walls could not hold his spirit. The wilderness could not contain his dreams. He was learning, growing, preparing, not yet for power but for purpose. As the wind rustled through the trees and the night sky shimmered above Little Pigeon Creek, time itself seemed to whisper his name. Abraham Lincoln, the boy who would one day awaken a nation. Candle Chapter 2, The Making of a Mind, 1817 to 1837. By the year 1817, the Lincolns had settled fully into the Indiana frontier, near the quiet banks of Little Pigeon Creek in Spencer County. The wilderness around them stretched endlessly, forests thick with oak and maple, the ground damp from morning dew. The air carried the scent of pine, smoke, and earth. Abraham Lincoln was now 8 years old. Tall for his age, with dark eyes that seemed to look beyond what others could see. His hands were rough from labor, his clothes worn thin, yet there was something luminous about his presence. A stillness, a curiosity that set him apart from other children of the frontier. Each morning before the sun rose, he worked beside his father, Thomas Lincoln, chopping wood, carrying water, clearing fields. By afternoon, his chores complete, he would sit quietly beneath a tree with a book in his lap. Books were rare treasures in the wilderness. Sometimes he borrowed them from neighbors miles away, carrying them home through the woods, wrapped in cloth to protect them from the rain. Among his earliest favorites were Aesop's Fables, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, and The Life of George Washington by Parson Weems. Those stories gave his imagination wings, teaching him that greatness could come not from birth, but from virtue, perseverance, and faith. In 1820, Abraham began attending a small log schoolhouse built by neighbors. It had rough benches, no floorboards, and a single window cut into the logs to let in a sliver of light. His teachers, Zachariah Riney, Caleb Hazel, and later Azel Dorsey, gave lessons on spelling, reading, and arithmetic. But young Lincoln learned more from the woods than the classroom. He studied the rhythm of rain, the silence of dawn, the way frost melted on tree bark. His mind was always searching for patterns, for meaning. He would borrow a spelling book or Bible, and after reading by candlelight, he'd practice writing on a wooden board with a piece of charcoal. When paper was scarce, he used the back of a shovel. When light was dim, he moved closer to the fire. Learning for him was not a task, it was hunger. Neighbors recalled that he read all the time. He read walking, sitting, resting, even during breaks from chopping logs. They teased him, calling him lazy, because he would stop to think instead of rush to finish his chores. But his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, saw the truth. She once said, "He did not love work much, but he loved learning better than any child I ever saw." She nurtured that spark. She encouraged his reading, kept his books safe, and told him stories about courage and virtue. Abraham adored her. Years later, he would call her "my best friend." By 1825, the boy had grown into a tall, lean young man, long arms, large hands, eyes full of quiet thought. He was already nearly 6 feet tall at just 16, strong enough to swing an axe from dawn to dusk. But his heart leaned not toward strength, but toward understanding. He began to write small poems, little reflections on nature, justice, and the human soul. His writing was awkward yet honest. When a neighbor asked why he wrote so much, he smiled shyly and said, "I'm learning how words can work for good." At night, under the soft glow of the fire, he read aloud to his family. His voice was deep and calm, already carrying the rhythm that would one day move a nation. He recited speeches from Henry Clay and stories from the Bible, trying to understand how truth could be spoken through simple words. But the frontier offered no rest. Tragedy often crept quietly into their lives. In 1828, his beloved sister, Sarah Lincoln Grigsby, died while giving birth. She was only 21. Her death struck Abraham deeply, another wound upon his tender heart. He helped dig her grave near Little Pigeon Creek, and when the last shovel of earth fell, he stood motionless for a long time. He rarely spoke of it afterward. But those who knew him said that sorrow made him gentler, more compassionate toward others' pain. In March 1830, when Abraham was 21, the Lincolns decided once again to move, this time to Macon County, Illinois. The journey was long and cold. They traveled over 200 miles by ox-drawn wagon, crossing frozen rivers and muddy trails. When they arrived, they built another cabin, logs stacked by hand, roofed with rough shingles. Here, Abraham's adulthood truly began. The endless horizon of Illinois seemed to mirror his own restlessness. He worked the fields, split rails for fences, and earned the nickname the Rail Splitter. Yet every evening when the day's work was done, he returned to his books. In 1831, seeking independence, he left home. He traveled north to New Salem, Illinois, a small village on the Sangamon River. There he found a world different from the frontier, a place of conversation, learning, and community. The locals saw something unique in the tall, quiet newcomer with the deep voice and gentle humor. He worked briefly as a store clerk for Denton Offit, then tried his hand at mill work, surveying, and even running for office. He failed often but never lost hope. He once said to a friend, "My best friend is the man who will get me a book I have not read." In New Salem he read law, slowly, carefully, by candlelight, borrowing volumes from John T. Stewart, a local attorney. He absorbed every page as if it were scripture. By 1836, through sheer persistence, he passed the bar examination and became a licensed lawyer in the state of Illinois. But before the law came leadership. In 1832, at the age of 23, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He lost that election, but earned the respect of the community for his honesty and calm integrity. That same year he volunteered for the Black Hawk War, a brief conflict between the United States and Native American forces led by Chief Black Hawk. Though he never saw combat, he was elected captain of his militia company, an honor he cherished all his life. Later he would recall, "I was elected captain of a company of volunteers, a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since." After the war he returned to New Salem, deeper in thought than ever. He continued reading, studying, and growing. He failed in business. He fell into debt. Yet, with every setback his character sharpened. His honesty became his armor. His empathy became his compass. By 1834 his persistence bore fruit. He was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. It was here that the boy from the log cabin took his first true step into history. In Springfield, the capital city where he later moved in 1837, Abraham Lincoln began practicing law in earnest. He walked miles through rain and snow to attend court sessions across central Illinois, carrying his books in a leather satchel. His clients were farmers, laborers, widows, people like those he had grown up among. He listened to them patiently, spoke to them plainly, and defended them passionately. He believed deeply in justice, not as a profession but as a moral duty. At night, he would sit alone in his small room, writing by candlelight. The law was his livelihood, but humanity was his purpose. He once wrote, "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true." And that truth became his quiet strength. By 1837, as the spring air warmed the prairies of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, now 28 years old, had transformed from a barefoot farm boy into a thoughtful young lawyer. His journey had been carved from hardship, study, and self-belief. He had lost family, fought poverty, faced failure, and yet each trial had refined him. His mind was a map of all he had endured. His heart, a reservoir of empathy for those who struggled as he once had. The boy who once read by firelight beneath the whispering woods now stood at the edge of destiny, not yet a legend but already a light in the darkness. And as the evening settled over Springfield, a single candle burned beside his desk. Its small flame flickered gently, casting long shadows across the room, as though history itself leaned in to listen. Candle Chapter 3, Storms of a Nation, 1840 to 1861. By the early 1840s, the town of Springfield, Illinois had become Abraham Lincoln's new world. The rough frontier boy was now a lawyer with a steady practice, walking each morning along Washington Street, his tall frame unmistakable, his hat slightly tilted, and a stack of legal papers tucked beneath his arm. He had joined the firm of John T. Stewart and later Stephen T. Logan, where his reputation grew, not for cunning but for clarity. He spoke gently in court, using plain language that farmers, laborers, and judges alike could understand. When he rose to speak, his words were never loud but always honest, carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. In 1842, on a crisp autumn evening, his life took another turn. On November 4, 1842, inside the home of Reverend Charles Dresser in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd, a spirited, educated woman from Lexington, Kentucky. She was everything he was not: refined, ambitious, socially confident, yet they shared one vital trait, a belief that he was meant for something greater. Their marriage was not always calm. Their tempers often clashed, but their love endured. In the years that followed, their home on 8th Street would echo with laughter, worry, and the cries of 4 sons. Robert Todd Lincoln, born August 1, 1843, Edward Baker Lincoln, born March 10, 1846, William Wallace Willie Lincoln, born December 21, 1850, and Thomas Tad Lincoln, born April 4, 1853. Yet even as family joy filled his home, a shadow began to rise over the country. The United States in the 1840s was expanding westward, chasing land and dreams, but also division. The question of slavery crept like a quiet storm across every debate, every new state entering the Union. Lincoln, a loyal member of the Whig Party, believed in progress, in canals, railroads, education, and enterprise. But he could not ignore the moral wound that slavery left upon the nation's soul. In 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 7th District. On December 6, 1847, he arrived in Washington, D.C., a city of muddy streets and candlelit halls, to serve his single term in the 30th Congress. There he spoke softly but firmly against the Mexican-American War 1846 to 1848, questioning President James K. Polk's claim that American blood had been shed on American soil. Lincoln's resolution earned him criticism from his own constituents, but he stood by his conscience. He also introduced the spot resolutions, demanding proof of where the war's first battle occurred, and publicly opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. These were not popular stances in Illinois, and when his term ended in March 1849, Lincoln quietly returned to Springfield. He resumed his law practice, taking long journeys across Illinois on horseback and by buggy, from Danville to Bloomington, from Decatur to Alton, arguing hundreds of cases in small courthouses and sleeping in village inns. His law partner, William H. Herndon, later recalled that Lincoln often gazed out the window during their travels, lost in thought. He was always thinking, always listening to some inner voice. In February 1850, tragedy struck again. His second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, fell ill with tuberculosis and died in their Springfield home on February 1, 1850, at the age of 4. Mary wept endlessly and Abraham grew silent. He worked harder than ever, perhaps to escape the weight of grief. Yet amid sorrow, his moral vision sharpened. The issue of slavery had grown impossible to ignore. In May 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, introduced by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a man Lincoln had known for years. The law allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, a principle called popular sovereignty. To Lincoln, this was a betrayal of the nation's founding ideals. He saw it as reopening a wound that should have been healed by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had restricted slavery's expansion northward. On October 16, 1854, Lincoln delivered one of his most stirring early speeches at the Peoria courthouse. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the crowd as he declared, "The real issue is the eternal struggle between right and wrong. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings." Those words marked his quiet re-entry into national politics. In 1856, as the Whig Party dissolved, Lincoln joined the newly formed Republican Party, uniting those who opposed slavery's spread. The following years saw him rise rapidly as a voice of conscience and reason. By 1858, the stage was set for one of history's most famous rivalries, the Lincoln E. Douglas debates. Between August 21 and October 15, 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen A. Douglas faced each other in 7 debates across Illinois, from Ottawa to Alton, before crowds of thousands. Douglas defended popular sovereignty. Lincoln, calm but firm, argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to expand. On October 16, 1858, before a vast crowd in Alton, he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." Those words echoed far beyond Illinois. Though he lost the Senate election to Douglas that November, Lincoln had gained something far greater: national recognition. Newspapers across the Union printed his speeches. People began to whisper his name as a man of uncommon honesty, humility, and moral clarity. As 1860 dawned, the winds of division grew fierce. Across the South, talk of secession filled the air. In the North, a new sense of urgency stirred. That spring, at the Republican National Convention held in Chicago, Illinois, delegates gathered inside the wooden wigwam building to choose their presidential candidate. On May 18, 1860, after 3 ballots, Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican candidate for President of the United States. His modest background, the rail splitter from Illinois, became the symbol of honest American self-made virtue. Through the summer and autumn, his campaign spread across the nation. He never traveled to make speeches, following the tradition of the time, but his words were carried by newspapers, pamphlets, and letters. On Tuesday, November 6, 1860, Americans went to the polls. When the votes were counted, Abraham Lincoln had won with 180 electoral votes, becoming the 16th President of the United States at the age of 51. Yet victory came wrapped in silence and fear. Even before March 4, 1861, the day of his inauguration, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had declared secession from the Union. In the frosty morning light of February 11, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the platform of the Springfield Depot, addressing his friends and neighbors for the last time before leaving for Washington, D.C. His voice trembled as he said, "To this place and the kindness of these people I owe everything. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. The train pulled away slowly, steam rising like mist into the cold sky. Mary sat beside him, quiet and pale. The journey eastward was long and anxious, through snow and shadow, as if the whole land held its breath. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before the U.S. Capitol, hand upon the Bible once used by George Washington, and took the oath of office. The crowd listened in silence as he spoke. "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Yet even as his words reached the sky, cannon smoke was gathering over Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The storm had begun. The boy from the woods, the lawyer from Springfield, now bore the weight of a broken nation. And the quiet fire that had glowed since his childhood, the one lit by faith, loss, and compassion, now burned brighter than ever. Candle Chapter 4. The War in the Words, 1861 to 1865. On the dawn of April 12, 1861, as the first light touched the waters of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, cannon fire broke the morning silence. At 4:30 a.m., Confederate guns, commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard, opened fire on Fort Sumter, where Major Robert Anderson and his small Union garrison held the flag of the United States. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours, echoing across the Atlantic coast. When the smoke cleared on April 13, 1861, the fort fell, and with it, peace itself. President Abraham Lincoln, who had taken his oath barely a month earlier on March 4, 1861, now faced the greatest trial in American history. 2 days later, on April 15, 1861, he issued a proclamation calling militia, summoning 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. In response, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. The United States of America was no longer united. In the summer heat of July 21, 1861, the first major battle unfolded near Manassas, Virginia, along the Bull Run River. Men marched in bright uniforms beneath banners that would soon be torn and bloodied. At Henry House Hill, Confederate forces under General Thomas Jonathan "Stonewall" Jackson stood their ground. By sunset, the Union Army retreated in chaos toward Washington, D.C., and the illusion of a short war vanished forever. Lincoln spent that night at the White House, pacing in silence. He had seen the lists of the dead, the broken, the lost, young boys from Illinois, New York, and Ohio, and he whispered to a secretary, "We must think anew and act anew." Through 1862, the war deepened its shadow. In February 1862, Union forces led by Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. But victory was fleeting. On April 6 to 7, 1862, at Shiloh, more than 23,000 men were killed or wounded, one of the bloodiest battles in American history up to that time. In the East, General George B. McClellan marched his Grand Army of the Potomac toward Richmond, Virginia, during the Peninsula Campaign, March-July 1862. But despite months of maneuvering, the Union Army failed to capture the Confederate capital. That September, the war reached its turning point. On September 17, 1862, along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, Union and Confederate soldiers clashed in what became the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Nearly 23,000 casualties lay upon the fields and cornrows by evening. When news reached Lincoln, he saw not only tragedy but opportunity. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebelling states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. That night, as rain fell upon the White House roof, Lincoln said softly to his cabinet, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." And so, at noon on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in Washington, D.C., with his hand trembling slightly not from doubt, but from the weight of history. Freedom came with fire. The year 1863 would test the soul of the nation like no other. In May 1863 at Chancellorsville, Virginia, the Confederacy won a costly victory under General Robert E. Lee, but lost one of its greatest commanders, General Stonewall Jackson, who was accidentally shot by his own men on May 2, 1863, and died on May 10. Then came July 1863, the month that would decide the nation's fate. From July 1 to July 3, 1863, Union and Confederate forces met at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Over 165,000 soldiers fought on the rolling hills and wheat fields. On July 3, during Pickett's charge, thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields into withering fire. When the smoke cleared, the rebellion's greatest hope had fallen silent. That same week, on July 4, 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, gaining control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Two victories, one in the east and one in the west, turned the tide of war. 4 months later, on November 19, 1863, beneath a cold gray sky in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, President Lincoln arrived to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. He stood quietly as Edward Everett, a famed orator, spoke for 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose, unfolding a small piece of paper with words he had written the night before by candlelight in the Wills house. His address lasted barely 2 minutes. 77 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He ended softly. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he sat down there was silence, not from indifference but reverence. In those few words he had rededicated a nation. By 1864 the war entered its final brutal chapter. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of the Union armies on March 10, 1864. His strategy was relentless. Press the Confederacy on all fronts until it broke. That spring he led his army into the Overland Campaign, Wilderness, May 5 to 7th, Spotsylvania, May 8 to 21st, Cold Harbor, June 1 to 3rd. Battles so fierce that even Grant whispered, "I regret this assault more than anyone I ever ordered." Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman began his march through Georgia. On September 2, 1864, he captured Atlanta, writing to Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." Then, from November 15 to December 21, 1864, Sherman's troops marched to the sea, burning, breaking, and leaving behind a message that the Confederacy could no longer endure. That autumn, the nation held its breath once more. On November 8, 1864, Americans voted. Despite war weariness, Lincoln was re-elected as president, defeating George B. McClellan. On the night of his victory, Lincoln looked from the White House window toward the dark city below and whispered, "This time it will be done, the work will be finished." The final blow came in the spring of 1865. On April 2, 1865, Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell to Union forces. The next day, April 3, President Lincoln entered the city on foot, walking through streets still smoldering from battle. Freedmen knelt as he passed, but he gently said, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel only to God and thank Him for your freedom." 5 days later, on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the American Civil War. Lincoln received the news in Washington that evening. He wept quietly, then walked alone through the White House halls. At last the long night had ended. Candle Chapter 5, The Last Light, April 1865 and Legacy Beyond Death. It was the evening of Friday, April 14, 1865, Good Friday, in Washington, D.C. The war was over. For the first time in 4 long years, the city exhaled in peace. The air was warm, carrying the scent of magnolia and spring rain. Flags fluttered across the Capitol. Church bells rang softly in the distance. Inside the White House, President Abraham Lincoln was in gentle spirits. He had breakfast that morning with his son Robert Todd Lincoln, who had just returned from General Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia. They spoke of peace, and the plans to rebuild a wounded nation. Later, at 11 a.m., Lincoln met with his cabinet. The meeting began with laughter and ended with hope. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Secretary of State William H. Seward, and others noticed a lightness in him, a joy they hadn't seen in years. Lincoln said softly, "We must lay aside malice and vengeance. The time for healing this nation has come." That afternoon he walked with Mary Todd Lincoln through the White House gardens, speaking of their future. He told her, "We will travel after this. You shall see the South, and then we will go to California." For the first time in years he dreamed of rest. That evening at 8 p.m., the President and First Lady rode by carriage to Ford's Theater, located on 10th Street Northwest, to see the comedy Our American Cousin. They were joined by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. At the same hour across town, John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor and Confederate sympathizer, prepared his pistol, a small .44 caliber Derringer, and a knife. Booth knew the play, the theater, and the president's habits well. He had performed there many times before. At 10:13 p.m., as the audience laughed at one of the play's loudest lines, Booth entered the presidential box unnoticed. He stepped behind Lincoln, raised the pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of the president's head, just beneath the left ear. The sound cracked through the theater like thunder. Major Rathbone tried to stop Booth, but Booth slashed him with his knife and leapt from the balcony, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants." He landed on the stage, broke his leg and limped out into the night. Inside the box, Mary Lincoln screamed for help. Dr. Charles Leal, a young Army surgeon in the audience, rushed forward. He examined the president and whispered, "His wound is mortal." The time was 10:15 p.m., April 14, 1865. Lincoln was carried out of the theater across the street to the small Peterson house, owned by William Peterson, a German tailor. They laid him upon a bed too small for his tall frame. He had to be placed diagonally so his legs would fit. Throughout the night, doctors worked in silence. Dr. Leal, Dr. Charles Sabin Taft, and Dr. Albert F. E. King, all trying in vain to save him. In the dim room lit only by oil lamps, his friends and cabinet members gathered. Secretary Stanton stood by his side, watching the slow, shallow breaths of the man who had carried the nation through fire. At 7:22 a.m., April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. His chest rose once, and fell. Stanton, eyes full of tears, looked at the still form and said softly, "Now he belongs to the ages." Outside, rain began to fall over Washington. The nation wept. That same morning, the hunt for John Wilkes Booth began. The War Department, under Stanton's command, launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Booth fled through Maryland, aided by Confederate sympathizers, including David Harold, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and Thomas A. Jones. For 12 days he evaded capture. But on April 26, 1865, at about 2:30 a.m., Union soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, surrounded a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm, near Port Royal, Virginia. Booth refused to surrender. The soldiers set fire to the barn. When he tried to flee, Sergeant Boston Corbett fired one fatal shot. Booth died shortly after, at 7 a.m., whispering, "Tell my mother I die for my country." The assassin was gone. But the wound he left would never fully heal. Meanwhile, Lincoln's body lay in state in the East Room of the White House. Thousands filed past his coffin in silence. The scent of lilacs filled the air. April 19, 1865, a Wednesday, was declared a national day of mourning. The funeral service began at noon, attended by officials, soldiers, and citizens from every state. From April 21 to May 3, 1865, a funeral train, called the Lincoln Special, carried his body from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, a distance of over 1,600 miles. It stopped in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, Cleveland, Chicago, and more. In each city, crowds gathered, hundreds of thousands standing in rain and wind, hats removed, tears falling. At Independence Hall, Philadelphia, where George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had once walked, Lincoln's coffin rested for a night. An old man in the crowd whispered, "He finished what they began." On May 3, 1865, the train reached Springfield, Illinois, the home he had left 16 years before. There, on May 4, 1865, beneath gray skies and a light drizzle, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The coffin was placed in a temporary vault while a grand tomb was prepared, the Lincoln Tomb, completed in 1874. In the years that followed, his words and spirit continued to echo through time. From the Gettysburg Address, November 19, 1863, to his second inaugural address, March 4, 1865, His voice became the conscience of a nation. In that final speech just 6 weeks before his death, he had said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Those words became his memorial, more enduring than stone or bronze. By 1867, statues of Lincoln began rising across America. By 1922, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., designed by Henry Bacon, stood complete, its dedication attended by President Warren G. Harding, Chief Justice William Howard Taft, and Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son. And there, beneath the marble columns, the great seated figure of Abraham Lincoln, sculpted by Daniel Chester French, still watches over the nation, solemn, gentle, eternal. More than a century and a half later, the candle of his life still burns quietly in the heart of the world. He was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. He died on April 15, 1865, in a modest room across from Ford's Theater. Between those two moments stretched a journey of courage, compassion, and unyielding faith in human dignity. And though time has carried his body to dust, his words remain alive, guiding every generation that seeks justice in the dark. If the story of Abraham Lincoln touched your heart, take a quiet breath and ask yourself, would you still stand for what's right? Even if the whole world stood against you? Would you hold to your faith in humanity when hatred and division tried to tear it apart? Or would you let the silence of fear decide your fate? Tell us what your heart whispers in the comments below. Because history isn't just about the past. It's a mirror reflecting who we are today. And if you wish to drift deeper into the stories of dreamers, rebels, and souls who shaped the world, then let this channel stay beside you, guiding you through the candlelight of time. Candle. For every time we wander through the echoes of history, we don't just remember them, we awaken a forgotten part of ourselves.